The plan was a fortress. Each wall was a rule, each rule a brick laid with the careful, desperate precision of a man escaping a flood. Rule 1. New city, no history. Rule 2. Find a job, any job, that paid in cash and silence. Rule 3. Keep your head down, your mouth shut, and your heart locked in a box buried so deep you'd forget where you put the key. The most important rule, the foundation of the entire structure. Need no one. My 1998 sedan was the getaway car, the vessel of my new life. It wasn't much, just 4 wheels and an engine that coughed more than it purred. But it was mine. It was the only thing that was. I had enough money saved for 2 months' rent on a room the size of a closet, and a diet of instant noodles and gas station coffee. It was enough. It had to be. Independence was a currency measured in how little you consumed, how small a space you could occupy. For 3 weeks, the fortress held. I drove for a food delivery app, a ghost in the city's circulatory system. I learned the grid of the streets, the dead ends, the shortcuts through sleeping suburbs. I spoke only to confirm order numbers. I was a shadow, a function, not a person. It was perfect. It was sterile. It was safe. Then, the rattling started. It began as a whisper, a faint tremor under my foot on the accelerator. I ignored it. I turned the radio up, the tinny sound of a pop song a flimsy shield against the sound of my future unraveling. But the whisper grew into a grumble, the grumble into a violent shudder. One Tuesday afternoon, on a crosstown expressway with the sun glinting cruelly off the endless river of cars, the shudder became a terminal seizure. A final metallic scream, a plume of greasy smoke, and then silence. A profound, horrifying silence that was louder than any engine. I was stranded. Not just on the side of the road, but in my life. The tow truck driver had a face like a worn-out boot and a voice that scraped. He named a garage a few miles away. Elijah's place, he'd grunted. He's honest, and he's cheap. Can't promise you more than that. Honest and cheap. The 2 pillars of a desperate man's prayer. The garage was a low cinder block building tucked away on a street of forgotten warehouses. The sign was faded, the paint peeling. It smelled of something ancient and industrial, hot metal, stale coffee, and the sharp tang of gasoline. It smelled like the end of the line. And then I saw him. He was leaning over the open hood of a pickup truck, his back to me. The word mechanic didn't seem large enough to contain him. He was built of solid, functional lines, broad shoulders, a thick waist, arms corded with a muscle that came from labor, not a gym. His hair was dark and shot through with gray at the temples, cut short and practical. Even from across the garage, I could feel a kind of gravity emanating from him, a stillness that made the noisy, chaotic space feel centered around him. He turned, wiping his hands on an already filthy rag, and his eyes found mine. They were a deep, quiet brown, and they held my gaze for a fraction of a second too long. He wasn't assessing me. He was simply seeing me. It was the first time in weeks anyone had. My fortress trembled. He was Elijah. The diagnosis was a death sentence. Transmission was shot. A few other Latin-sounding words were thrown in, but they were just decorative nails in the coffin. He named a price that made the air leave my lungs. It was a number that didn't exist in my world. It was more than I had, more than I could make in 6 months of living on fumes. I must have looked the way I felt. like a man watching his lifeboat sink. "Can't do it," I said. The words were small, pathetic. Elijah didn't offer sympathy. He just watched me, that same unnerving, steady gaze. He looked at my hands, clean and uncalloused. He looked at my worn-out sneakers, my thin jacket. He looked at the desperation I was trying so hard to hide. "I need an extra pair of hands around here," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't an offer of charity, it was a statement of fact. "Shop boy. Cleaning, organizing, passing wrenches, simple stuff." He gestured with his chin towards the greasy, cluttered expanse of the garage. "You can work it off, hour for hour. I'll keep a ledger. When the debt's paid, you get your car." My mind, my fortress, screamed at me. No, this is a breach. This is dependence. This is letting someone in. But my mouth, traitor that it was, said, "Okay." The lie was born in that moment. A beautiful, necessary lie. I told myself with every ounce of conviction I had left. This is a job, a temporary business transaction. He is my employer. I am his debtor. There are lines. There are rules. The lie was the new wall I would build around myself, right here in the heart of his territory. It was the armor I would wear every single day. It wouldn't be enough. The first day was a lesson in insignificance. My world, once defined by the solitude of my car and the anonymity of the city, shrank to the four greasy walls of this garage. My purpose was to be a shadow to Elijah's substance. He moved with an economy of motion I found mesmerizing. Every tool he reached for was the right one. Every turn of a bolt was precise. He didn't waste a single gesture. I, on the other hand, was a mess of clumsy angles. I tripped over air hoses, fumbled sockets, and managed to get more grease on my face than on the parts I was supposed to be cleaning. He never got angry. He never even seemed annoyed. He would just stop, take the tool from my hand, and demonstrate the correct way to hold it, his calloused fingers brushing against mine. The contact was brief, impersonal, instructional. A teacher correcting a student, but my skin registered it as fire. A low electric hum that traveled up my arm and settled somewhere deep in my chest. "It's nothing," I told myself, scrubbing a brake caliper with frantic energy. "It's static electricity. It's the cold. Another brick for the wall." The forced proximity was the true torture. The garage was large, but the spaces we occupied were small. We'd be folded together into the tight confines under a car lift, his arm brushing my shoulder as he reached for a light. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a solid, living presence that made the air thick and hard to breathe. I learned the landscape of his scent. It was a complex map of motor oil, coffee, and a clean, sharp smell of cedarwood soap that clung to the collar of his shirt. I found myself breathing it in, cataloging it, trying to solve it like a puzzle. My rules of engagement were simple. Keep conversation to a minimum. Need this one? Where does this go? What's next? He seemed to operate by a similar code. Our days were scored by the clatter of metal, the hiss of pneumatic tools, the grunt of effort, but rarely by words. The silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that settled over us. In my old life, silence was safety. Here it was charged with a tension I couldn't name. It was a container for everything that wasn't being said. After a week, the financial reality of my situation became undeniable. The closet I was renting was a drain I couldn't sustain without an income. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, the numbers doing a frantic, losing battle in my head. One afternoon, as I was sweeping up metal shavings, Elijah spoke from behind me. "There's a room in the back." I turned. He was wiping his neck with a rag, his expression unreadable. Used to be a stockroom. Got a cot. A sink that works most of the time. You could stay there. Add it to the ledger. My fortress walls cracked. The offer was a lifeline and a death sentence. To live here? To sleep and wake in this space that was so saturated with him? To never have a moment of escape from his orbit? It was a violation of every rule I had established for my own survival. I don't want to impose, I mumbled, the words feeling flimsy and absurd. He just looked at me. That gaze again. The one that saw through the flimsy excuses. It's empty. Might as well be used. And just like that, the breach was complete. My world didn't just shrink to the garage. It became the garage. That night, I moved my single duffel bag into the small, windowless room. It smelled of dust and old cardboard, but underneath it all was that same scent of oil and Elijah. There was no escaping it. I lay on the lumpy cot, listening to the sounds of the garage settling for the night. The groan of cooling metal, the drip of a faucet. And later, fainter, the sounds of him moving around in his small apartment above. The floorboards creaking. The muffled sound of a television. He was a constant presence, a weight in the air. I was living inside his world, breathing his air. The lie of a simple business transaction was becoming harder and harder to maintain. This was not an employer-employee relationship. This was something else entirely. Something far more dangerous. The new routine was a kind of monastic devotion. I woke before dawn, the chill of the concrete floor seeping through my socks. I'd make my way to the small, grimy bathroom, and by the time I was done, a mug of coffee would be sitting on the workbench. Black, no sugar. Exactly how I took it. He never mentioned it. It just appeared, a silent ritual. The first time I saw it, a hot, confusing wave of something like gratitude washed over me. I crushed it immediately. It was a provision for an asset. He needed me functional. That's all it was. Another brick. Thicker this time. My body, soft from weeks of sitting in a car, began to change. My hands, once clean, were now permanently stained with grease in the creases. They were raw, scraped, and starting to callous. My shoulders ached. My back was a constant, dull throb. But it was a good pain. It was the pain of purpose, of earning my keep. The unintentional touches became the focal point of my days. They were tiny, insignificant events that my mind would seize upon and replay for hours. He'd be showing me how to bleed a brake line, his larger, warmer hand covering mine to guide the pressure on the wrench. Steady, he'd rumble, his voice close to my ear. And my entire nervous system would ignite. My breath would catch. My heart would hammer against my ribs. I would focus on the cold, hard steel of the wrench, on the drip of brake fluid, on anything but the weight of his hand, the heat of his palm against the back of my knuckles. One afternoon, we were wrestling with a stubborn, rusted-out exhaust system. We were on our backs, on creepers, side by side under the car. The space was so tight, our shoulders were pressed together. I could feel the solid wall of his body against mine, the rhythm of his breathing. "Push on 3, he said, his voice muffled in the enclosed space. We pushed. The pipe groaned but didn't budge. Again. We pushed again, a coordinated grunt of effort. The bolt finally gave with a screech of tortured metal. The sudden release sent my arm flying, my hand scraping hard against a piece of the undercarriage. I hissed in pain, pulling my hand back. "You all right, Noah?" He used my name. He rarely used my name. It sounded different in his voice. Solid. Real. "Fine," I said, my voice tight. He slid out from under the car. A moment later, his face appeared next to mine. "Let me see." It was a command, not a request. I reluctantly held out my hand. A long, deep gash was welling with blood across my knuckles. Before I could protest, he took my hand in his. His grip was firm, grounding. He held it up to the dim light, his thumb gently swiping away the blood and grease to inspect the cut. His touch was rough from calluses, but surprisingly gentle. It wasn't a clinical inspection. It was care. My traitorous heart stuttered. He's just making sure his employee can still work. The thought was a desperate shield, but it felt thin and brittle. He held my hand for a few seconds longer than necessary, his gaze fixed on the wound. I was transfixed by the sight of his large, stained hand holding mine, the stark contrast between us. "Come on," he said, finally letting go. The loss of contact was a sudden, sharp cold. He led me to the grimy sink and methodically washed the cut, his movements efficient and sure. He poured stinging antiseptic over it without a word of warning, and I flinched, but didn't pull away. He wrapped it tightly in a clean rag. Throughout the entire process, he didn't speak, but his focus was absolute. It was the same intense concentration he gave to a faulty engine. And for some reason, that felt more intimate than any words could have. That night, lying on my cot, I stared at my bandaged hand. I could still feel the phantom pressure of his grip, the rough texture of his skin against mine. The fortress was crumbling. The lie was wearing thin. This wasn't about a car anymore. I wasn't sure what it was about, but it was terrifying. I was in his orbit, and the gravitational pull was getting stronger every day. Resisting it was taking every ounce of energy I had. The days bled into one another, a blur of grease and steel, punctuated by these small, charged moments. My internal monologue became a frantic, looping analysis. Why did he look at me like that? Did his hand linger on my shoulder, or was I imagining it? Why does the silence feel different today? I was a detective, searching for clues in a case where I didn't even know the crime. The case was Elijah, and the evidence was sensory overload. I knew the sound of his walk, a heavy, measured tread that was different from anyone else's. I knew the specific way he sighed, a quiet, breathy sound, when a part refused to fit. I became an expert in the micro-expressions that flickered across his face, the slight tightening of his jaw when a customer tried to haggle, the barest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth when an engine finally turned over with a smooth, healthy roar. My senses were dialed to a frequency that was tuned only to him. I'd be on the other side of the garage and would know, without looking, that he was drinking coffee, because the rich, dark scent would suddenly cut through the chemical haze. I felt his presence as a change in atmospheric pressure. The air grew heavier, warmer, when he was near. The seeing, though. That was the most dangerous part. It happened one evening, long after closing time. We were finishing up a rush job, a minivan for a family that needed it for a trip the next morning. It was one of those miserable tasks where every bolt was rusted and every part fought back. We were both exhausted, drenched in sweat, and covered in a film of grime. I was trying to fit a new alternator belt, my fingers clumsy with fatigue. The damned thing kept slipping. My frustration mounted with each failed attempt, a hot, tight knot in my chest. Finally, it slipped one last time, and the wrench I was using clattered to the floor. I didn't have the energy to pick it up. I just leaned my forehead against the cool metal of the engine block and closed my eyes, defeated. I was tired, not just from the work, but a deep, soul-level weariness that had been my constant companion for years. In that moment, I let my guard down. I forgot to be the capable, stoic worker. I was just me, a tired kid in over his head. I braced myself for a gruff command to get back to work, for a sigh of impatience. Instead, there was only silence. I waited. The silence stretched, growing heavier. Slowly, I lifted my head and turned. Elijah was standing a few feet away, rag in hand, just watching me. And the look on his face, it stopped my breath. There was no pity in it, no annoyance. It was a gaze of profound, unnerving clarity. It was as if he could see straight through the grease, through the flimsy walls of my fortress, and was looking directly at the exhausted, frayed thing I kept hidden inside. He saw the desperation that had driven me to this city. He saw the loneliness. He saw the fear. He sees me. The thought was not a comfort. It was a terror. To be seen was to be known. To be known was to be vulnerable. And vulnerability was a luxury I could not afford. My armor, so carefully constructed, felt like it was turning to dust under the weight of that single look. I wanted to run, to build the walls back up, to shout that he was wrong, that there was nothing to see, but I couldn't move. I was pinned by his gaze. He held it for a long moment, then blinked slowly, as if coming out of a trance. He stepped forward, picked up the wrench from the floor, and held it out to me. "Here," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Let's finish this. Together." The word hung in the air between us. Together. I took the wrench, our fingers brushing. The spark was familiar, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just a jolt of surprise. It was a current of connection. A circuit being completed. We finished the job in a new kind of silence. It wasn't tense anymore. It was shared. We moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, an easy rhythm that hadn't been there before. When we were done, he closed the hood of the minivan and simply said, "Good work, Noah." He clapped me on the shoulder. It wasn't a fleeting touch. His hand was heavy, warm, and it stayed there for a full 3 seconds. A grounding pressure that seemed to say, "I'm here. You're not alone in this." I stood frozen in the middle of the garage, long after he had disappeared up the stairs to his apartment. My shoulder burned where his hand had been. The fortress was in ruins. The lie was a whisper. And for the first time since I'd arrived in this city, the terrifying thought that I didn't want to be alone felt more true than the rule that had kept me safe. The thought that maybe, just maybe, I didn't want to be. The shift was subtle at first, a change in the emotional climate of the garage. The dynamic was no longer just about the car or the debt. My purpose began to warp, twisting from a self-centered need for survival into something more complex. It started with the mail. I was organizing a pile of invoices and flyers on the cluttered desk in the corner office when I saw them. A stack of envelopes with angry red lettering. Past due. Final notice. They were from parts suppliers, the utility company, the city tax office. I shuffled them quickly to the bottom of the pile, a hot, sick feeling in my stomach. It explained so much. The long hours he worked, long after I'd collapsed onto my cot. The way he'd sometimes stare into the middle distance, his jaw tight with a tension that had nothing to do with a stubborn bolt. The unshakable, self-sufficient man I had built up in my head was an illusion. He was just as precarious as I was. Maybe more so. He had something to lose. A few nights later, the illusion shattered completely. I was woken by a noise from the garage, a loud metallic crash, followed by a string of muffled curses. I lay still for a moment, my heart pounding. Then, cautiously, I got up and cracked open the door of my room. The main bay was dark, except for the single, stark light above his workbench. Elijah was there, his back to me. He was standing over a transmission he'd been rebuilding, a heavy, complex piece of machinery. A wrench lay on the floor where he'd thrown it. His shoulders were slumped, his head bowed. He brought his fist down on the steel workbench, a sharp, percussive sound of pure frustration. Then he just stood there, breathing heavily. He leaned his weight on the bench, his head hanging, and in the harsh glare of the single bulb, I saw his shoulders begin to shake. It was a quiet, contained earthquake. A man breaking apart in the silence of his own world. My first instinct was to retreat, to close the door and pretend I hadn't seen. This was a private moment, a weakness. His armor was down, and seeing it felt like a violation. It was too intimate, too raw. My own rules screamed at me to give him his space, to maintain the professional distance. But something else, something deeper and more powerful, held me rooted to the spot. It was a fierce, protective surge that I didn't recognize. The man who had seemed like a mountain was crumbling, and the only other person in the world who knew was me. The dynamic didn't just shift, it inverted. In that moment, he was not my employer, my savior, the one holding all the cards. He was just a man, drowning under a weight I couldn't see. And I, the helpless debtor, the clumsy apprentice, felt an overwhelming, illogical urge to be his anchor. I stepped out of the shadows. The scuff of my shoe on the concrete was loud in the silence. He stiffened, his back going rigid. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, a statue of pride and pain. I walked slowly towards the workbench, my heart hammering. I had no idea what to say. Words felt useless, intrusive, so I didn't use them. I picked up a clean rag from a pile on the bench. I walked over to the ancient coffee maker, which was still half full of lukewarm coffee from the afternoon, and poured what was left into a clean mug. I walked back and set the mug on the bench next to his hand. He still didn't move. I could see the tension in the cords of his neck. I stood there for a moment. Then I picked up the wrench he had thrown. I placed it back in its designated spot on the pegboard behind the bench. Then I started to tidy up. I began sorting sockets, wiping down greasy tools, coiling air hoses. I moved quietly, methodically. I wasn't cleaning. I was standing watch. I was creating a perimeter of order around his chaos. I was telling him, without words, I'm here. I'm not leaving. You are not alone in this wreckage. Minutes passed. The only sounds were the soft click of metal on metal as I worked, and the sound of his ragged breathing, which was slowly, almost imperceptibly, evening out. Finally, he moved. He reached out and picked up the mug. His hand was shaking slightly. He took a long swallow of the cold coffee. He turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face etched with an exhaustion that went bone deep. The mask of the stoic mechanic was gone. All that was left was Elijah. "The bank," he said, his voice rough, broken. "They called today." He didn't need to say more. I understood. This garage, this life his father had built, was on the verge of being taken away. "We'll get that transmission done tomorrow," I said. My own voice sounded strange to me. It was steady, calm. "And the brakes on the Ford. That's good money." He stared at me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. I wasn't the scared kid anymore. I wasn't just his shop boy. I was his partner, his ally. He gave a short, sharp nod. a concession, an acceptance. From that night on, everything was different. We were a team, united against a common enemy of debt and deadlines. I stopped just following orders and started anticipating his needs. I learned to have the right tool in his hand before he asked for it. I learned how to read the tension in his shoulders and know which job was causing him the most stress. I took over the front desk, dealing with customers, writing up invoices, my neat handwriting a stark contrast to his rough scrawl. I was shielding him, taking on the small battles so he could focus on the war. My debt was forgotten. We never mentioned the ledger again. I was no longer working off a car. I was working to save this place. To save him. The walls of my fortress hadn't just crumbled. I had torn them down myself and used the stones to build a barricade around us. The irony was a bitter, quiet taste in my mouth. I had come to this city to need no one, and now my entire world revolved around being needed by this one man. And the terrifying truth was, I had never felt more purposeful in my entire life. The pressure mounted. Each ring of the phone made Elijah flinch, expecting another creditor. We worked from sunrise until long after the moon was high, fueled by cheap coffee and a shared, silent desperation. The air in the garage was thick with it, a tangible thing you could taste. We moved in a state of heightened awareness, the unspoken tension a wire pulled taut between us. We were working on a big job, an engine rebuild that promised a payout big enough to keep the wolves at bay for another month. It was the final night. We had to have it finished by morning. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. My hands were raw, my mind foggy with exhaustion. We were on the final torque sequence for the head bolts. It was a delicate, precise operation. Elijah was reading the specs from a manual, and I was on the wrench. We were leaning over the engine bay, shoulder to shoulder, our heads almost touching. His voice was a low, steady murmur in my ear, a physical vibration I could feel in my teeth. 90 foot-pounds. Easy now. I pulled on the torque wrench, my muscles straining. It clicked, signaling the correct pressure. Good, he breathed. The warmth of his breath ghosted across my neck, and I shivered, despite the stuffy heat of the garage. Next one. We continued in this way, a ritual of quiet commands and physical exertion. The rest of the world fell away. There was only the engine, the glow of the work light, and the two of us, locked in this small circle of intense focus. He was so close, I could see the flecks of silver in his 5 o'clock shadow, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The scent of him, oil, sweat, cedarwood, was overwhelming and intoxicant. We finished the last bolt. It was done. We both straightened up at the same time, a synchronized sigh of relief. We were standing face to face, closer than we had ever been before. The work light cast his face in sharp relief, all harsh angles and deep shadows. His eyes, dark and unreadable, were fixed on mine. The hum of the fluorescent light overhead was the only sound. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The air was electric, charged with every unspoken word, every accidental touch, every shared look from the past months. It was a physical force pressing in on us. I could feel the heat rolling off his skin. I could see the slight pulse beating in his throat. This is it, a voice in my head whispered. The final threshold. I should have stepped back. I should have made a joke, broken the spell, retreated to the safety of our established roles. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. The old Noah would have already been halfway across the garage, building a new wall, but the old Noah was gone. He'd been dismantled piece by piece in this garage. Elijah's gaze dropped to my mouth, then flickered back up to my eyes. A question was there, hanging in the space between us, a terrifying, hopeful question. He didn't move. The choice was mine. The final, conscious act of surrender. To cross the few inches that separated our world from a new one. To abandon the last remnants of my rules and my fear. My breath hitched. My hands, of their own accord, clenched into fists at my sides. I was fighting a war inside myself. The years of self-preservation, of rigid control, screamed at me to run. But the quiet, steady pull that had been growing since the day I walked in here was stronger. A magnetic force I had no desire to fight anymore. "Elijah," I whispered. His name was a prayer, an admission. A muscle jumped in his jaw. He didn't speak. He just watched me, his expression a mask of tension, waiting. I took a breath, and then I closed the distance. It wasn't a kiss. It was something more fundamental. I stepped into his space, into the heat and the scent of him, and I rested my forehead against his. My eyes closed. The rough fabric of his work shirt was scratchy against my skin. I could feel the solid, unyielding wall of his chest, and behind it, the heavy, thudding beat of his heart. It was the most real thing I had ever felt. He didn't move for a full second. I felt his surprise, a sharp intake of breath. I thought for one horrifying moment that I had made a terrible mistake, that I had shattered everything. Then, his hands came up. They didn't grab me. They settled on my upper arms, his grip firm, grounding. He wasn't pushing me away. He was holding me there. He was holding me together. A shudder racked my body, a release of all the tension, all the fear, all the desperate yearning I had kept locked away. I sagged against him, my strength completely gone. His grip tightened, taking my weight. One of his hands moved from my arm up to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. He pulled me closer until my face was pressed into the hollow of his shoulder. I breathed him in. Oil, sweat, soap, safety. It was the smell of home, a home I never knew I was looking for. "Stay," he murmured, his voice a rough vibration against my ear. It wasn't a command. It was a plea, a raw, desperate plea that mirrored the one in my own heart. "I'm not going anywhere," I whispered into his shirt. The lie was finally, utterly dismantled. It wasn't about the car. It had never been about the car. It was about this desperate, terrifying, beautiful need. I had come here to be alone, and I had found the only thing that made sense. He held me, his arms a fortress around me. Not a fortress of isolation like the one I had built for myself, but a fortress of protection, of belonging. My cheek was pressed against his collarbone, and I could feel the frantic, hammering pulse of his own heart, a rhythm that matched the wild cadence of mine. The silence that fell was not empty or tense. It was full. It was a shared space of surrender, a quiet territory we had claimed together. We stood like that for a long time, locked together in the center of the greasy garage floor, under the harsh, buzzing light. The world outside, with its banks and its deadlines, and its lonely, anonymous streets, ceased to exist. There was only the solid weight of him holding me, the steady beat of his heart under my ear, the rough texture of his shirt, the grounding scent of his skin. He was the first to move, but he didn't pull away. He simply shifted his weight, his hand on the back of my neck, tightening its grip slightly. A gesture of reassurance. He guided me backwards until my legs hit the edge of a workbench, and I sat, my knees feeling weak. He didn't release me. He just knelt on the floor in front of me, so that our eyes were level. His hands moved to rest on my knees, his large palms covering them completely. A warm, heavy weight. He searched my face, his own expression stripped bare of all its usual stoicism. I saw the vulnerability he had hidden so well. I saw the loneliness that mirrored my own. I saw the bone-deep weariness, but underneath it now, a flicker of something new. Relief. Hope. Noah, he said, and my name was a sound of discovery. I couldn't speak. I could only look at him, my own confession plain in my eyes. The pretense was gone. The carefully constructed roles of employer and debtor, of teacher and apprentice, had been burned away in the intensity of the last few minutes, leaving only the raw truth of us. Two men, adrift and clinging to each other in a storm. He lifted one hand from my knee and brought it to my face. His thumb, calloused and stained with the day's work, traced the line of my jaw with a feather-light touch that sent a tremor through my entire body. He swiped it gently under my eye. I hadn't even realized I was crying. "Scared of what?" he asked, his voice low and quiet. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question. He was asking about the fear he'd seen in my eyes for months. "Everything," I admitted, the word barely a whisper. "Of this." His thumb stopped its movement, resting on my cheek. "Me too," he confessed. And that simple admission, that shared vulnerability, was the final lock clicking open. The fear didn't vanish, but it lost its power. It was no longer my burden to carry alone. It was ours. He leaned in, and this time I knew what was coming. I met him halfway. It wasn't a kiss of passion or frantic desire. It was a kiss of quiet understanding, of arrival. His lips were chapped and tasted faintly of coffee. It was slow and gentle and profoundly grounding. It was a promise made without words, a sealing of an unspoken pact. When he pulled back, the air between us had changed forever. The static tension was gone, replaced by a calm, humming energy. A new kind of silence settled over us, comfortable and deep. It was the silence of two people who no longer needed to guess what the other was thinking, because they were finally on the same page. We didn't talk about the future. We didn't talk about what this meant or what we were. There was no need. The answers were in the way he was looking at me, in the steady pressure of his hands on my knees. The immediate future was the engine we had just rebuilt. It was the sunrise that would be coming in a few hours. It was the coffee that he would make, and the mug he would leave for me on the bench. He finally stood, pulling me to my feet with a gentle tug. He didn't let go of my hand. He just held it, his fingers laced through mine, his rough, strong grip a constant, reassuring presence. "Come on," he said. "Let's clean up." And we did. We moved around the garage, putting tools away, wiping down surfaces, our hands occasionally brushing, our shoulders bumping. But now the contact wasn't a shocking jolt. It was a simple, easy confirmation. You're still here. I'm still here. We're still here. Later, he locked the big bay door. He turned to me in the near darkness, his silhouette a solid, reassuring shape. He didn't say, Go to your room. He didn't say, good night. He just held my gaze for a moment, then turned and started up the creaking wooden stairs that led to his apartment. He left the door at the top open. An invitation. I followed him. His apartment was small and sparse, but clean. It smelled like him, like laundry and wood smoke and that cedarwood soap. It was a space that was wholly his, and he was letting me into it. It felt more intimate than anything that had happened downstairs. He pointed to a small, worn armchair. Sit. I sat. He disappeared into a tiny kitchen and returned with 2 glasses of water. He handed one to me, then sat on the edge of a simple wooden coffee table in front of me. He didn't drink. He just watched me, his knees almost touching mine. The new silence stretched. But it was a comfortable wait now, a shared stillness. We were just 2 people, existing in the same space, breathing the same air, the storm outside and inside finally having passed, leaving this quiet aftermath. I finally understood. The fortress I had built wasn't to keep the world out. It was to keep myself in. It was a cage of my own making, designed to prevent the very connection I was starving for. Strength wasn't independence. It wasn't needing no one. True strength was the terrifying, heart-stopping vulnerability of letting someone see you. All of you. And trusting them to stay. Elijah reached out, his hand covering mine where it rested on my knee. His touch was warm, solid, real. A silent promise that whatever came next, we would figure it out. Together. The unspoken pact was forged. The future was a blank, unwritten page. But for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid to turn it. I was home.